This video is going to be about the current relationship between the United States and Russia and the escalating tensions that is basically leading us into a second Cold War, in my opinion, and in the opinion of, I think, a lot of people. So, obviously, for the past 2 years, we've all been sort of subsumed by this story about Russian collusion and Mueller's investigation. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm basically going to skip over that. I'm not going to talk about that much because it's still an ongoing issue. The Mueller report is out. I haven't read it, and I know there's a lot of controversy over it, but I really just don't have the in-depth details as to what exactly it reveals. So I'm just not going to comment on it. There's plenty of people talking about that already anyway. So I want to talk a little bit about the rising escalation of tensions between the United States and Russia that goes all the way back to the Cold War. Because a lot of people look at Trump and they see the way that he speaks in sort of glowing terms of Vladimir Putin, and they think that obviously Putin has something on him, or he's working with Putin, they're in bed together, he's an agent of Russia, etc., etc. And I always looked at it differently, and I could be wrong because I've misjudged Trump in the past. I really thought that his whole persona was an invention, was basically he was a con man, he was a marketing tool, and that wasn't really him. And now I'm starting to increasingly find that no, I think it really is him. But my intuition about, so that's just to say that I'm perfectly aware that I've been wrong about this sort of thing in the past. But my intuition about Trump is not that he's this sort of conspiratorial agent of Russia, but rather that he's just a generally shoddy and corrupt businessman who, was willing to try to win basically any way that he thought he could. And so he took the meeting with the Russians, or his son took the meeting with the Russians, because they said they had dirt on Hillary, and they wanted whatever dirt they had, and they didn't think that was going to come back to haunt them. But I don't think that there's a deep conspiracy there. I think it's more just they were in over their heads. They really didn't know what they were doing, running a political campaign, and they were so used to breaking the rules routinely, probably behind the doors doing business, that they didn't understand how all this dirt was going to get dug up and dragged out in front of the public. But that's all I'm going to say about that whole situation. But basically, the interesting thing about Trump was that he spoke in questioning terms regarding NATO. He spoke in very friendly terms regarding Russia, and this was a severe break from the status quo of how people have dealt with the Russians in American politics. Obama got a lot of criticism for being too lenient on Russia, but that was basically just because he was a lenient guy in general, and I do think that was one of his weaknesses, was dealing with international conflict. I don't think that he showed a strong enough hand with regard to the United States upholding our interests and not backing down to adversaries. The classic example being the Red Line in Syria. Everybody remembers that. But also, when Putin invaded the Ukraine, it didn't look good for us at all. And I'm not saying that we should have went in and had an intervention in Ukraine, because I think that would have been a disaster. But it just didn't look good. And a lot of it was Putin was playing his hand, because he basically knew we were bogged down in these wars and that we couldn't afford to do anything about the Ukraine. You think about this. In the Cold War, that the idea of the Soviet Union invading a country that was going over towards NATO, that was on the border, and in this sphere of influence that we would have been heavily invested in, that would have been an extremely provocative move, and it likely would have led to further altercations. In this case, it was still provocative, but not nearly as much, because we basically shifted our focus over onto the Middle East and the war on terror. And Putin realized this, and he knew that our hands were tied and there wasn't much we were going to be able to do about it. So the message with that invasion, and with the invasion of Georgia, and with the various dick-waving antics that Putin did throughout the Obama administration, and to some extent continue to do during Trump's administration, is basically Russia's back. We're a force to be contended with, and there's not as much that the United States can do about it as we would have liked to think, especially in the early stages of the post-Cold War world, where the United States really just seemed to be this one monolith of power that nobody could question. Increasingly, we're getting basically the Russians are being very obstinate in pursuing their own geopolitical agendas, because they've seen, I believe, that after the Cold War, that whole containment strategy that was supposed to go away, because that was supposed to be a strategy in essence that was meant to deal with the Soviet Union, who were these ideological foes that had this competing economic system that we just couldn't abide by. Well, the Soviet Union collapsed, but the containment strategy went nowhere. It's still the status quo strategy towards Russia today, and our aggressive attitude about NATO and encircling Russia and trying to expand the influence of NATO in Eastern Europe it continues to this day, and it never let up. So the Russians saw essentially that they lost a lot in terms of stature. They made too many concessions, and so Putin is basically a reaction to all of this to say we need to regain some of that ground that we lost when the Soviet Union collapsed. So they're not going back towards a communist economic system, but they would like to more closely resemble the Soviet Union in terms of their sphere of influence and their power. And so, we get things like Crimea, and we get things like Georgia, and we get things like, just Putin being very obstinate towards the United States, because there's not a lot of room for real cooperation on equal terms. We're not willing to deal with Russia on those terms. We're basically looking to undermine them and continue to undermine them, because we don't frankly like competition, especially when it comes from a country that we don't have deep ties with, that we're not deeply interdependent on, and that we can't control in other ways, or that we can't at least benefit from in other ways. Like China, everybody would say China is much more of a threat in terms of economically, in terms of geopolitically, and just in terms of their power and their influence. They're a much bigger force to be reckoned with than Russia is. But the reason that we're not as concerned with China, I believe, is because we're so economically interdependent with China, and we're basically, they need us, we need them, and neither one of us is really looking for an all-out conflict, because it would be terrible for both of us. And that just isn't true to the same extent with Russia. So China still, like, for instance, will side with Russia when it comes to issues like this. And the reason why is because we're the top dog, and they can combined, China and Russia can use their leverage to basically undermine our dominance to one extent or another. But all in all, the leader of China, I forget his name, I think it's Jing or something, it's Xin, I can't remember, but or she, is it she? I can't remember what it is, I'm sorry. But anyway, the leader of China isn't taking the same provocative moves that Putin is taking, because Putin's really looking not just to pursue his geopolitical agenda, but also to make us look weak on purpose. He's really trying to, he's trying to, in addition to actually get shit done, he's looking to create this propaganda narrative that the United States is this declining, fading power, and that Russia is on the rise. And so, once again, we have to go back to the Cold War to really understand this. And I already mentioned the containment strategy, which basically doomed us to be adversarial. And this idea, the fact that this containment strategy continued past the fall of the Cold War, basically vindicates the idea that many have had, that the Cold War was not ever really just about communism versus capitalism. We tend to really view it in these ideological terms because that was the narrative, frankly, that both sides were pursuing. That was the narrative that really looked better for them if they were standing for a cause rather than just pursuing their own selfish geopolitical interests. Um, but also just because that just seemed to be the obvious, intuitive uh, way to look at it when you consider the fact that communism is this global system that is supposed to be the international, basically it's supposed to be this universal, all-encompassing economic system, and so is capitalism. So they really can't coexist on the planet peacefully, to be honest with you, especially not when the two major powers are on opposite sides of that issue. um, but a lot of people have pointed out that the Cold War was likely to happen even if Russia, or I should say, they've speculated that the Cold War was likely to happen even if Russia wasn't communist and they were a capitalist country, just because we were the two major powers that were left over after the fall of all the other major powers in the world wars. And basically, we had this naturally competitive stance towards one another because of this. And that makes intuitive sense as well. And I think that that point of view has been vindicated by the fact that our strategies towards Russia have not really changed drastically with the fall of the Cold War. We're basically still trying to undermine and contain Russian power. And this goes back further than Putin's rise to power, because they would like to say, well, because Putin's this thug and this dictator, and we can't abide that. That's not really what it's about. Whenever it's a dictator or a thug that they can't abide, it's one that undermines their own geopolitical interests. Like right now, Maduro in Venezuela is a perfect example of that. And I'm not sticking up for Maduro, but it's just kind of convenient that we always take this, oh, we can't allow this sort of thing whenever it's a country that that geopolitically we have some sort of gripe with. There's plenty of dictators and thugs in the world, and we don't deal with all of them. We pick and choose the ones that it's convenient for us to try to deal with. And I think most of that comes down to geopolitical strategy. So, what's it called? So really, what this fundamentally comes down to is, like I say, the Cold War is essentially coming back. And some signs of this are that the treaties that came about to basically stabilize the world order and allow for a peaceful coexistence between the United States and the Soviet Union, which became Russia, that really cemented the peace in the Cold War, or in the post-Cold War world, were these missile treaties that that we weren't going to continue to escalate the aggressions, especially in Eastern Europe, that could escalate into an actual conflict. And so there was treaties like the ABM Treaty and the INF Treaty, which are now both defunct, and neither side is compliant with either one of these treaties. George Bush pulled out of the ABM Treaty in 2001 because in his war on terror, he deemed it too much of a nuisance, and he wanted to build these missile complexes in Poland, of all places, for whatever reason, to fight terror. And of course, the Kremlin was very dubious, very, very mistrusting of George Bush's line of reasoning, and I think it's obvious that he was right. That George Bush was not being completely upfront about what his actual objectives were in Poland. And then, Obama dialed some of this back, which is where he gets a lot of criticism for being too lenient on Russia, yada yada yada. But he was lenient on a lot of people. He wasn't just lenient on Russia. But there was still definitely an adversarial tone between the United States and Russia during the Obama administration. And then, of course, Hillary was waging this sort of proxy war in Syria against Assad, who is an asset of the Kremlin, which is a big reason why we have a big problem with Assad. Once again, this convenient selecting of which dictators we're outraged by. And then, Trump, his administration, I don't know how much Trump had to do with it, but his administration finally issued an ultimatum to Russia that they haven't been in compliance with the INF Treaty since 2014, and that they had like 180 days or whatever it was to bring themselves into compliance with this treaty. Otherwise, we were going to pull out altogether as well. And Putin basically said, "Go fuck yourself," and so now neither one of us are complying with either one of these treaties. And so basically, the order that had upheld the peace and the truce and the non-aggression from either side, both of those have gone by the wayside. And we've seen aggression in the Russian sphere of influence. We've seen them invade Georgia. We've seen them invade Crimea, and they have no sort of remorseful or repentant sort of stance towards, oh yes, this was a terrible thing, but we had to. No, the message is, when it's good for us to do this, we're going to do it. And the other message is, hey, you guys are doing the same shit, and you're not just doing it in your own backyard, which I think the Russians really have a point when it comes to this part. Crimea is actually extremely important to Russia geopolitically. That's their access to the Black Sea. That's always been a very important thing. And the fact that it could fall into this adversarial regime was extremely troubling to them. Compare that to Iraq for the United States. Yeah, Saddam was a brutal dictator and a tyrant, but compare how important Iraq is supposed to be to us to how important Crimea is to the Russians, and it becomes pretty hard to criticize that they're too interventionist when they're interfering in their own backyard, in their own sphere of influence, and we're interfering all over the world wherever we find it convenient to interfere. And we don't seem to learn the lessons of history. I'm not a non-interventionist. I'm not an isolationist. I believe that war has its necessity and its merits, and I believe in a strong military. I'm not one of these people, cut the military budget. No, because the research that the DoD does is one of the primary ways that technology gets advanced. So I really and also our naval supremacy plays a huge role in maintaining basically economic dominance worldwide. So I don't want to cede any ground on those lines. But where I do agree with the non-interventionists is that we pick all these stupid wars to go into. These places where we're like halfway invested and we're not really willing to go the full way. And this was the case in Iraq, this was the case in Libya, this was the case in Syria, and this has been the case in various Latin American countries before Venezuela, and now it seems to be the case in Venezuela if anything comes about down there. So we really need to learn that half-assed regime change just doesn't work. If you're not willing to go, the only time that we've ever seen successful regime change come about from us invading a country has been two examples, and both of them were in World War II, the Germans and the Japanese. Those were the two times that we went in, we destroyed a regime, and we built from the ground up a better regime. And just keep in mind the amount of bloodshed that had to be exerted in order to make this happen. Keep in mind that we were firebombing cities to the ground, not because they were military assets, but because we needed to break the spirit of the people to resist. That we did the same thing in Japan, in Tokyo. We did the same thing with the nuclear bombs in Japan. So I've got off on a bit of a tangent here, but just because I was thinking about that whole Venezuela thing, but also thinking about the United States and our stance worldwide in terms of well, we've got our eggs in sort of every basket around the world, and I think Russia is exploiting this to a certain extent because they're realizing that their strategy is very focused and very narrowly confined to the spheres of influence that are really important to them, that they're actually willing to fight for because they actually matter. And they knew that Crimea just meant way more to them than it did to us. That was the gamble that Putin ran, because we could go in and crush the Russians. Make no doubt about it. I mean, militarily, they can't really withstand the United States. But it's a matter of all these wars that we've lost over the past century. Every war after World War II that we've basically sunk our teeth into and came away with either a partial victory or a complete defeat or just something substandard that we weren't happy with. It's all been because we went into this arena where we weren't fully invested, where we weren't willing to go the full extent because it wasn't our country and we weren't that concerned with it, and we were really just just trying to prop up this order around the world that benefited us. But when push came to shove and too many heads got cut off in the process, then we pull out and we find a way to exit, and we leave chaos and destruction in our wake, and not a better political order. And so Russia sees this, and they understand, because they've had their own experiences with this, with Afghanistan, the Soviet Union, and so they understand that they can invade Crimea. Why? Because it means something to them, and it means something to us, but it means way more to them. And so I think that that's a lot of where this apparent strength is coming from. Like, you try to imagine, why would Russia be like able to intimidate the United States militarily, in these geopolitical issues? Why would they be able to wave their dick around, just to rattle their saber, that's a phrase, right? And we wouldn't respond in kind. And I think the reason is because they're picking the right battles. They're picking things that actually matter to them. Syria matters way more to them than it matters to us, because we've got our eggs in too many fucking baskets around the world. And we every time something happens anywhere in the world, if it's involving these major, relatively major regional powers, it matters to us because we have some invested interests in that geopolitical sphere of influence. So it's going to be interesting to see how things go forward. Like I say, I think that it's pretty patently obvious that we are headed towards another Cold War with Russia and increasing hostilities with Russia. And it's possible that China, we could be more hostile with them if the trade war heated up. But I think, like I said, this situation with China is much more stable because of our commercial interdependence. It's very hard to go too hard against them, and vice versa. But it will be interesting to see going forward how these I don't think there's going to be an outright conflict between the United States and Russia, most likely. We haven't seen anything like that since World War II, to have two major powers go against each other. But I think that if history tells us anything, we're very likely to see plenty more proxy wars and these little conflicts around the world where we poke and jab at each other from the sidelines, trying to undermine each other. And I don't know how it's going to play out in the end, but I think that we should try to take some of the lessons of history and understand that not every fight is worth fighting. Only go into a fight if you're willing to actually fight it.